said, let's move to our next panelist, and that is Karen Bates. And Karen is going to share a little bit about our next prompt and take it from there. She's going to introduce herself and then share a little bit more. So Karen is up.
My name is Karen Bates. I'm an assistant pastor at Healing Place Church in Waldorf, Maryland. I also operate Alabaster Box Ministry Services, and I've been a pastor for more than 25 years. My question deals with what are the challenges of being a Black leader or leading a Black church in a predominantly white church or denomination. One of my issues as a pastor who led a predominantly Black congregation in a white denomination was that sometimes there wasn't a full understanding of the challenges that the people from my congregation faced. Even though my congregation was in a rural area that was predominantly white, we still, as people of color, faced a number of situations that people didn't always understand. There was a time when the Klan came to our town, and the pastor at the time, he took an active role in fighting that, but he didn't feel that there was any support from anybody up above. I asked, well, did we talk to somebody? And so the thing is that you just never know. And so there has to be a link of communication so that you understand what your people are going through. There was also the challenge of trying to get, there was a prominent member of the community who was coming to our church. And when I encouraged her family to join, one of her issues was that she didn't see any people of color when she went to a denomination gathering. And she said there weren't enough people of color. And I told her, I said, well, if you join, that gives us more. But her issue was that she said, I have a daughter and a son, and I want them to see images of themselves, and they're not going to see it. And when they're they don't always see it when they're going to school because of where they live. What they see when they come to church is good, she said, but when they go outside of the church structure or when they go outside of being here in church, I want them to be able to see people of color doing things. And so they went and joined the AME church. But the thing is that we have to realize that we have to speak to the issues that people of color have. And then the other thing is that we can't automatically guess or think that because we're Republican, they are all Republicans. We had a district official come and tell us we weren't supporting the Republican president at the time well enough. And the only issue is that the church was made up of Republicans and Democrats, more Democrats than Republicans. And the chairman of the county's Democratic Party was a member of the church. And he and his family, it kind of upset them. And there was a lot of backstory. There were a lot of things that went on in the background that I didn't share with the district official because I didn't think the person was in the place where I could have a conversation with them without it not being hurtful to either one of us. And that's not good. And so there has to be an understanding of where are people? Even though we're okay, how do we have the discussion that says, where are your people? What are the challenges that face your people? How is it that, or us together, and how do we deal with them? What are some things that we can do to make things easier for you as a person of color? You don't always get that. And so not understanding that it's a challenge for me as a Black woman to not have to come to district conference and there to be few Black people or Black women who I can see in positions of leadership. And the question becomes, how is it that I can ascend to beyond where I am if I don't see anybody beyond where I am? And what steps, I think there need to be people who can help us understand, here are some steps you can take to go to the next level. Here are some things that you can do. Because of my job in my secular employment, I was being promoted up the ladder, and those skills are transferable. The question is, well, where do I go? What jobs are available to me? What positions are available to me? Who is going to say to me, who's going to mentor me? And the thing is I ended up with mentors who were not part of the church, who were not part of the denomination. And so when you get to that place, the mentors are like, why are you still there? You need to go find some place where people are going to move you up or do something with you, or at least appreciate your skills and things like that. And so you end up in a place where you wonder sometimes, okay, why am I here? And then you hear God say, because this is where I have you. And sometimes being the trailblazer, if that's what you want to call it, that's what you're called to do. And sometimes we don't like that, but that's what the calling is. And so the challenge is learning how to work within the structure and not being seen as the angry Black person, and not being seen as always being sour because you call people on things, but learning to be able to say, look, we need to do this collaboratively, and then get people to understand that it is it's a whole group thing. It's all of us. It's not you and it's not me, and it's not you do you and you and I do me. It's how do we do us together? How do you do you and I do me, and then we do it together? Because if we can do it together, that's what God calls us to do, is to be workers together. And because we are workers together, how do we get to the place where we understand that one of the conversations we need to start having is, when are we going to see women of color as a district superintendent? When are we going to see a man of color as a district superintendent? Because when we start having those conversations, we can begin to lay the groundwork and say, this is what we need to do, and this is how it can come to fruition. How do we start identifying people who have the gifts and the skills to do those kinds of things? The people, when in my secular employment at one place, one of the things that they had was, they called it a promotable list, and everybody wanted to be on the promotable list. But if you were on the promotable list, they did things to invest in you, and they prepared you so that when promotions came available, they knew you were ready and able to take that next step. And the thing is that there needs to be some way that we identify who are the people of color who have the gifts and the skills to do that. And the thing is that the truth is that some of us have the gift and the skills to have the higher callings and to be district superintendents and maybe even general superintendents. But the thing is that nobody has looked beyond where we are, because we haven't been able to break the glass ceiling, because we haven't been able to get out of where we are. And some people, when I was pastoring in the small town, people always saw me as the pastor of the little Black church in Marietta. And the thing is that was who you saw me as. But I saw myself as a pastor who had many gifts and skills, who honed those gifts and skills and didn't always get a chance to use them in the church on a broader scale, because I couldn't break free from where I was to go to the next level, to do the next thing.
But, one of the things that my grandmother used to say, this is tight, but it's right. And so I say to Karen, and what she just shared, and I see several people in the chat menu have already commented on how meaningful what you just shared was. It's difficult to hear this reality. And this is one of those conversations, when you love family, you got to talk, right? You got to do some real talk. That's what the young folks say now, like real talk about what's really happening. And that's one of those places where we need work, right? We need some real dialogue and candor as we unpack what that might mean, because that's a systemic issue, right? The fact that we are a denomination, I'm focusing now on the Wesleyan Church, we're a denomination whose history is rooted in abolitionists, whose history is rooted in inclusion, but yet we don't see people of color at the highest levels of leadership in our denomination. That's a systemic issue. That is a systemic issue that we must address, and there must be a leadership pipeline that addresses it, right? And so, and not saying it, not talking about it, that inactivity is in some ways part of the problem, and so we must vocalize it and create systems to change that. So thank you, Karen, for bringing that up. Not just people of color, but specifically women of color who have a there's an intersection going on, right? Where it's not just men of color, but there's the intersection of race and gender, two levels of oppression that many of our women of color, specifically Black women, are facing. So thank you for bringing up that intersection. And so now we're going to move to the next prompt, and Natasha's up to share a little bit more from this context.
Black churches have a unique gift and responsibility and practice, I would also say, of taking the history of the Black people and bringing that to bear on the Word of God in the pulpit. And I think we probably culturally do that in a very normal, authentic way, because so much of our faith is shaped about God being a liberator for Black people. And so even now, when I'm feeling low or discouraged with the issues of racism in America, one of the first things I do, in addition to just going to worship and going to some of those old songs that have carried our people through for many years, is I go to listen to the voice of a Black preacher, because what the Black preacher does is that he or she, they take what we are struggling with from racism and oppression throughout history, and even sometimes daily in our country right now, and they bring the truth of the word to bear on that, so that when they're ministering from the pulpit, that Black people leave the church encouraged and hopeful and armed with the knowledge and the truth to persevere in the faith in spite of the oppression and racism that we face.
And so, man, this reality of what the Black church brings, right, in the face of racism, in the face of discrimination against women, if you look at leadership in the Black church, the majority of the leadership in the Black church is actually Black women, right? And so that's something we haven't mentioned, but it's worth noting. And so that's significant. Now, the thing that I think is important is this transition as we begin to look at some of the dynamics of how the Black church and Black leaders interface with what might be considered the white church or predominantly white churches or multi-ethnic churches. And so Kenny Russell is one of our younger leaders. He's I think our only millennial on the panel, and he's up next to just share a little bit of his story, a little bit of his background, and to interface with our next prompt. So Kenny, you're up.
Hey man, I appreciate it, Santis. Like you said, my name is Ken, and born and raised in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And after high school, helped Pastor Troy Evans planting the edge. And so I've been a part of the West End Church for about 7 to 8 years now. And so graduated high school in 2007, helping Pastor Troy plant the edge in 2008, 2009. I later then went to Indiana Wesleyan and graduated from there in 2013, and then just finished up a Master of Divinity from Asbury Seminary this past May. And so kind of went through the ranks, if you will, from going through our educational institutions, and then now trying to jump into, the real world, into real ministry, and then trying to figure out what the Lord is doing from there. And so the question that I was given was what prevents Black Christians from attending predominantly white churches? And man, when I first got that, I was writing down answers. I had a whole list. I'm going to try to narrow it down just a little bit, so I pray that you bear with me. But the three things that I try to boil everything down with, the first one was the normalization of whiteness. Even in the question, right, what keeps Black Christians from attending predominantly white churches? There's a normalization in there that, Black people would want to go to white churches. I mean, so what's the value of white space, right? Why do we even think that Black Christians want to go to these white spaces? What's found in what's found in the white church that's not found in the black church? I mean, so why is it that are we presupposing? Why is it that white churches, white Christianity, white faith is presupposed as what's normal? But then also, why is it that black and brown people must go to white churches? Someone talked about the resources and everything that was mentioned in terms of what's in the white church and some of the challenges the black church faces. But why is it that white people aren't attending black churches, bringing their resources without gentrifying the whole community? So there's a problem that I see with the normalization of whiteness in our churches. The second piece that I saw there is the whiteness of white churches. One of the things that I've noticed in our institutions and in our churches is that most of them lack a very strong racial consciousness. They're not safe spaces, from my experience, to think through racial consciousness, racial identity. They're not places where you can go and bring up, this is what I'm experiencing as a black male, or whatever your racial identity is. And so because of the whiteness in these white churches, it tends to be pushed back, or you see people who don't even have a racial consciousness. They're not necessarily thinking about what it means to have a racial identity. So you see a lot of our churches perpetuating this color blindness kind of mentality, which we all know as we look at it and study it more, is very violent. It's not helpful. And so the lack of racial identity, and that happens across all spectrums, right? It's not just white people not having a racial consciousness. I've been in some of our churches where there's been black people who don't have a racial consciousness. And so that's difficult for people who do have a perhaps more mature racial identity or racial consciousness, and trying to navigate some of that, where you have people who are white who have not thought about what it means to be white, and you have people who are black or whoever who have not thought about what it means for them to be a racialized being. And so the lack of racial consciousness in these spaces is a bit of a problem, especially with people who do try to have a higher racialized consciousness. Another piece about the whiteness of white churches is white saviorism. You see a lot of well-intentioned, well-meaning, good-hearted, white Christians who come into a place because they feel that they're sent to save non-white people, to civilize non-white people. And while the intentions are great, the consequences and the perspective that's used to justify some of the actions are very damaging, not only for the people that are being served, but for the white people who are doing the serving. And so white saviorism is a huge problem in a lot of our churches and in our organizations and institutions that really does go unaccounted for. And the last part, in terms of the whiteness of white churches, is white assimilationism. And here I want to be very careful because I recognize and I honor black and brown people who feel called to white churches. And I also want to honor white people who feel called to black and brown spaces. And so I want to recognize that, but the majority of our churches are completely disconnected from their urban core, the city. So you see a lot of them on the fringes of this city or on the suburbs of that city. And so when we think about what it means to be be a part of some of these churches, part of the cultural DNA of these spaces is white assimilationism, right? Because of the cultural DNA, black and brown people have to come in and get into the good fit for these churches. And so what that actually means is that they come in and they're trained and raised and taught to think, act, and worship like white Christians. And so this white assimilationism is a problem that we haven't really thought through. And a lot of it is because of the lack of a racial consciousness, a racial identity. But then even my own experience with, and this is the third part of navigating the whiteness of white churches. The first one is what I've seen as a minimalization. And what I mean by that is that as a black person, as a person of color, I often have to minimize my cultural identity just to be palatable in these spaces. And so the way I talk, the way I communicate, the mode of discourse, the jokes I use, I have to tailor what I say to white people. I mean, I can guarantee that if this dialogue was an in-group, just all black people, this conversation would have gone completely different. It would have been different. We would have said things. We would have joked differently. and everything would have been completely different. But because white people are present, we have to minimize what we would want to say, what would perhaps be more authentic, so that we can just have a communication, right? And so to minimize who I am just so I can befriend you, or so that you can befriend me, is a huge thing that I've experienced in navigating the whiteness of white churches. Another thing is the tokenization that you see, because most of these churches have so few Black and brown people, they're very quickly tokenized, and so they become the spokesperson of Black people or of Hispanic people, of whatever. And so the problem with that, though, is that, I mean, as has been said, Black culture, the Black church, has such a variety of expressions. It's a bit difficult for someone to be tokenized, to be the representative for all Black people. You know, and even in some of the things that I've experienced in our denomination, while I appreciate the offers and opportunities that I've been given, it's a bit difficult and frustrating when I know it's not really because I'm educated, right? It's not because I have a beautiful smile and I'm photogenic. It's because I'm one of the only few Black people in this group. And so whether it's in promotional material, whether it's teaching opportunities, whatever that is, it's often because I'm Black, which is really dehumanizing for me, especially when, you know, you want to say it's because I'm educated, because I'm qualified, because I'm called, because I'm anointed, when it's not. It's because I'm Black. Another thing is the paternalization, and this is kind of attached to the white saviorism, but that when Black and brown people attend these white churches, what often happens is that, from my experience, is that there's a paternalization that takes place, right? So when I bring up something from a Black perspective, very quickly it's denounced or moved to the side, or marked and defined as making up. It's some sort of illusion. And because of someone who has perhaps a different experience, or perhaps more experience from a white perspective, that my experience cannot be true. And so I need to be educated on what's real or what's true, because what I'm experiencing as a Black person isn't. And so you see a lot of paternalization that takes place in our white churches. Another thing is the demonization. And this is one that hits home for me in our denomination, because I've been around for so long and I've changed and I've grown, is that especially when Black people come to our spaces and they've been around for a long time, and you start to see changes in growth, when they stop quoting certain people that we all agree on, whether it's Clement of Alexandria because I love the early church, or whether it's John Wesley because we're such a fan of John Wesley. When we stop quoting these people and we start to quote Cone, we start to quote Malcolm, we start to quote Baldwin, people who are fighters for justice, people who have represented the Black community for so long, and we're not dieting on the same things anymore, very quickly, Black and brown people are demonized because they're not quoting the same people and they're not raising the same kind of questions. They're raising questions that want to prick the racial consciousness or the lack thereof. And so it's been challenging for me because when you raise questions that challenge the racial consciousness or the lack thereof, you're pushed off and you're demonized and you're defined as the angry Black man. And I'm not angry. I might be more passionate than you, but I'm not angry. And so why am I demonized, and why am I pushed to the margins, and why are resources taken away, opportunities taken away, simply because I express a different perspective? And so that's been a huge challenge in my experience. And so that's one thing. And the last thing in navigating the whiteness of white churches is, quite frankly, taxation. It is very difficult to be Black in a predominantly white denomination. You're taxed emotionally, you know, with everything that's going on in our churches and our country, and you don't see the response that our church should be responding, or the way that it should be responded. You know, you're taxed because, you know, you're not resourced the way that you should be resourced. You're not utilized the way that you could be utilized. You're taxed because as soon as something happens and people want to know about race, you're the one they flock to. And so it's like, I can't go to lunch or dinner or coffee with everybody. I need you to have more than one Black friend, please. Because as much as I like free food, I can't eat that much, you know, and I can't go to dinner with everybody. And so it's taxing. mentally, emotionally, physically, relationally, financially. It's just very taxing. And so you end up wondering, is it worth the cost? And am I really one that have to pay that cost? And so these are some of the things that, from my experience, prevent Black Christians from attending predominantly white institutions or white churches. And that's what I would say with that one. So appreciate it, Santi.
No doubt. Thank you. You know, one of the things that you bring up, man, there are several powerful points. But one of the things that you bring up is consciousness, right? And consciousness often is revealed by our diet, right? Our diet of what we take in, you know, who we read, things we study, who our mentors are, who's pouring into us. And so one of the things that you're going to hear me say probably for the rest of our time today is, and Natasha's going to bring it up in just a minute as well, is what does our diet look like, right? So if we are really committed to this conversation, if we're really committed to inclusive ways of changing and the dynamics of our systems as a denomination or as a church, even if you're not Wesleyan, the question becomes, what is our diet, right? If our diet remains the same, very little is going to change, right? But if our diet shifts, then our perspective shifts, our level of consciousness shifts, and the way in which we engage certain issues begins to become more transformative. One of the things that I bring up, and I'm gonna come back to a question for Kennedy specifically, one of the things I've shared in the past, I'm gonna share real briefly here, is I call it ethnic clusters. Brian Laritz has a book called Right Color, Wrong Culture. It came out years ago. Amazing book. If you haven't read it, I strongly recommend. It's called Right Color, Wrong Culture, Brian Laritz with a Y. And he brings this up, and I've kind of repackaged it for my context to call these ethnic clusters. So you have, and all of them begin with a B because I'm a formerly Black Baptist preacher. But the first one is what we would call bulk. So the bulk group is the dominant group. In our context as a denomination, that group would be white. And so that's where the majority of people are, the majority of the way the systems are ran through the bulk culture. Then you have that first layer is the border group. A border group is a group of people who identify racially or ethnically as another group. So in my context, that would be African American, but they culturally identify mostly with the bulk group. So I may be African American ethnically, racially, but culturally identify with the bulk group. So most of our white churches, for example, the first people who have a tendency to come and stick at a white church are typically border people. Border people don't need to see people like them to stay because they're not looking for people like them to stay. They're looking for a cultural experience that they identify with. And so the border group is significant. Now, that group is really important because they often become the people who help to the process to begin of the church changing and shifting. Now, the problem with the border group, is the white community has a tendency to believe that the border person is able to rally all the other Black people or all the other people who look like them or talk like them or are familiar with that particular cultural experience. But that's not true because the border person culturally doesn't identify with their ethnic group. They identify with the bulk culture. Does that make sense? The second group is the bridge group. The bridge group either grew up border or they grew up base, which is the last group we're talking about. The bridge group is the group that kind of speaks both languages, and they've learned through personal experiences how to adapt, right? How to be in one culture and then how to move into another culture. They're extremely important, but they're not fully understood by either group, right? And so they kind of live between worlds. You need bridge people, but you also need this last group. The last group is called the base group. The base group is the group that preserves the history, they preserve the culture, they preserve the language. That's where the majority of that ethnic group or racial group will lie. So if you're trying to reach people within that particular ethnic group, you won't be able to reach them with border people. You're going to have to reach them with bridge people and base people. And base people and bridge people often base people and border people often bump heads because they have totally different experiences, right? And so what has to happen is there has to be spaces like this where you have varying perspectives and you can hear both. You can hear a border person say, I don't need this, but you also need to hear a base person say, I need this. So a base person has to see people who look like them to stay. A bridge person doesn't have to, but it absolutely helps. A border person doesn't need to see people like them to stay at all. And so when you see that there's this diversity even within the group, and this would be true of any ethnic group, I'm speaking Black in this context because that's the context of our webinar and my personal context, but you begin to see that there's great breadth in what we're having conversations about. So a lot of our churches have mostly border people. Many of our predominantly Black churches have mostly base and bridge people, right? And so there's a different way in which we interact because there are different groups of people who are part of our church. I could go on, but I'm going to move because I wanted to ask this question. Kenny, as someone who is educated in our Wesleyan universities, both in undergrad and now in seminary, could you share a little bit more about like what it's like for you to find a fit and to find a place where you can use your gifts and use how God has anointed you in this particular season?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. What is it like for me as a Black male trying to find a good fit? And probably one of the most difficult things that I've had to navigate in my few years on this earth. One of the reasons why is because there's such a gross disconnection. And what I mean by that is that there's a disconnection from Blackness and from the Black community. And as I mentioned earlier, to even be in this denomination, to be in our educational institutions, to be in our churches, and to at least have a safe and healthy, and I put those in quotes intentionally, but to have a safe and healthy experience, I have to minimize who I am. And so there's a disconnect from my own Blackness. I can't say and be and think and act and speak the way that I would want to, because if I do, then I'm going to either be demonized or labeled and defined some other way that's not true of who I am. And that's largely because of white ignorance or white fragility. And so a lot of that is frustrating because there is such a huge disconnect. And so I have to fragment who I am just so that I can be in this space. And so that disconnect in terms of my own Blackness is very challenging. Another type of disconnect is that, I'm disconnected from the Black community. Now I recognize that not all Black people identify with group thinking or with communal thinking, but I do. And so it's frustrating and it's challenging when so many of our churches are, as I said, on the outskirts of this city or in the suburbs of that city. And I'm asked to go to this place because there's so many opportunities, but I'll be the only one that looks like me, or I'll be one of maybe 3 or maybe 4 or maybe 5 if I'm lucky. And so it's frustrating because while there are so many opportunities, they're always apart from and vastly distant from the Black community. And so there's a great disconnect, and not only from my Blackness, but also from the Black community. Another piece is the dehumanizing consequences. And I touched on this with the minimalization and tokenizing and all that other stuff there. But what I want to at least reiterate and maybe summarize here is that navigating this time of my life has been very dehumanizing. And I've been approached by a number of churches in our denomination. And my experience has been that I have to go where the opportunity is, not where I'm called. And so because so many of our churches need Black people, they need people of color, well, there's this opportunity or that opportunity. And I don't get to recognize that I'm called to a specific place. I'm called to help a specific people. I'm called to do this and to do that. And because we don't have opportunity, we don't have resources to support people who are trying to minister to a people group, I don't get to honestly serve in the capacity that I feel called and anointed to. And so I have to, again, change who I am just to be here. And then the last one is the disunity in Christ. And I mean, there's scholars out there who would recognize and have recognized with Divided by Faith and other resources that, especially along conservative lines, conservative white Christians and conservative Black Christians may completely agree on fundamentals of the faith, but how they envision what that means for their livelihood, what that means for how to live out the Christian life, puts them at very desperate odds. And so there's a strong disunity in Christ when I see that I'm in these churches, and what it means to be Christian for our personal lives is something totally different from a white sister brother and myself. And so that disunity has been difficult in trying to find a good fit. What it means to be Christian is important for when you're pastoring, when you're ministering, and when there's such a vast difference in how Christianity is applied and lived out. It's become challenging. And so that leads me to reflect on what would be said to our white sisters and brothers in our white institutions and our white churches. And one is the distinction between intention and attention. I don't know if our denomination, I don't think our denomination hates Black people, but I know what's taught in our institutions. I know what's preached and lived out in our churches. And it's not always, but it's most of the time difficult. It's challenging. And so that's a difference, and there's a difference between well-intentioned hearts and the actions and intentions or attentions of people. And so while you're well-intentioned, while you may be well-intentioned, it's difficult for me to trust what's in your heart when what's in your hand and how you use it communicates something very different. And so attention, how you're spending your time, how you're spending your resources, what you're eating and dieting in terms of your material and the conversations that you have, your attention will determine where you're at. And the last piece is the reciprocated change. And I've mentioned in several ways in which I have to change just so I can be in this space. And so I can't help but wonder, when will white sisters and brothers in our white churches, when will our white institutions begin to think about how they need to change so that I can be in their spaces? And so if I'm the only one that has to change so that this can work, I'm left to wonder, will we ever see a deep change, or should I find somewhere else to go so that I can fit? And that's probably what I would have to say on that. So I appreciate it, Santis.
Come up, I've watched it. It's in the thread in the comments now. Someone has talked about, there it is right there. It says, to the white pastor, can you give up your power over it, or do you have to control its outcome? And someone else talked about white fragility. Those are real issues that if we're going to really talk about a viable multi-ethnic movement within this or any other denomination, are going to have to be wrestled with. But the more important question for me, and this is the one that Santis, you and I, every time we have a conversation, I bring this one to you. We're going to have to wrestle with this is there a space within our denomination for viable, healthy, growing Black and African American churches, where there isn't a feeling that if Griffin is not moving to have the next multi-ethnic ministry as a Black leader, that something is wrong. That I actually, as Kenny talked about, can serve the space I'm in and the call I have, and we all still love Jesus, love one another, and if folk come, we're gonna love them, but this is what I'm doing, and this is what God is sending, and I have to be faithful to what he's putting in the net. Now, I don't know where that fits, but that's something that I thought was, as I heard different folk talking, I kept saying to myself, this is some good stuff, but there is a piece of this that I'm not sure is ready yet for public consumption, but it is the elephant in the room from my perspective anyway.
Yeah. Kenny, like what you're just talking about, man, is like we hate to hear, right? Like it's one of those things where it's like, man, like why is that your experience? And what personally can I do to change that? What systemically do we need to do to change that? Like that should not be so. I think part of what you're hitting at is the expectation that often happens, not just in our denomination, but in many denominations, is you're the person that does all the changing. Like you're the one that does all of the shifting, but the church doesn't, right? The church leadership doesn't. The structures of that particular ministry doesn't, but you're expected to change. And so you've heard me say this, if you've been a part of webinars in the past, I'm gonna say it here, like there has to be a shift for us where we are as transformed by other people's experience as we're expecting them to be transformed by ours. And so a lot of what happens in our denomination is come and become a part of us, but you have to do all the changing instead of come, let's become one, where we both are transformed. And I think that is what we have to begin to look at as a denomination and in our churches, is that we can't expect the people that God is sending us to do all the changing. We have to be willing to do some of the changing as well. And until that happens, we are going to push people away, and they will create other spaces, which leads to this next piece that Natasha wants to share. So Natasha is up.
When I graduated from seminary in 2014, it was interesting to me to see that there were a lot of women, several women of color actually as well, that would graduate, some of them in a MDiv program, some of them were excellent at the language work, and they would graduate without jobs. And that was a little bit discouraging, because that's why they went to preach and to teach, and they felt called to that. I see that struggle. I also see in a lot of our churches that, you know, pick a church on a website, if it's not a predominantly Black church, that they're not offering opportunities of leadership for people of color. And I see that as well as an author. So even today, I'm on Facebook and a question is being asked, well, how can we, you know, what do we need to do to get more speakers of color at a conference? And so there's some very tangible things I think we need to address, because there are some systemic problems going on here of what is the norm, whose voice is norm, whose spirituality or experience, or what's normal. And what's normal is not always the Black, the Latina, the Asian, the Native American, indigenous people group voice. And so I think that we have a responsibility as leaders, especially in this time, to be intentional in who we read, then there needs to be an intentional effort to say we will not make a selection until we have people of color at least being interviewed, because there are qualified people of color out there. If there's a conference that's being planned, that we need to have people of color in the conference lineup, not just doing workshops, but also on the platform to give keynote addresses, because there are qualified people out there. You know, we need to be saying the same thing about the things we're recommending to our flock. So if we're reading material, if we're speaking people's name from the pulpit, how many of those books that we're using for small group and Bible study are authored by people of color? So that's some things that I think every pastor, every seminary professor, what we're recommending to read in our seminaries, right? All of these things are very intentional actions that we need to take that will have long-term effects. What we do or do not recommend in seminary determines the diet that a pastor is going to have in their own personal study and devotion, and it's also going to determine what they preach and what they're going to present to their flock in Bible study and small group and discipleship training. So all of that stuff is very important. We have to be very intentional in that. The last thing I would say to that, for the Black leader of color and Christian leader of color in this time, I do believe very firmly that the Lord is asking of us to start prayerfully considering what is our third way of leadership. Starting conferences. I just came back from a trip, a learning trip from Rwanda that was led by a team of African-American women, and we took a team of African-American women. So I just think that we are in a season right now that, yes, we do need to be knocking on doors. Yes, we do need to be getting a seat at a table. Yes, we do need to speak with boldness and confidence in using our voice. But if those doors are closed to us, and if we cannot get a seat, that we are building a new table.
Wow. Now that is what you might consider a drop the mic moment. Right. And I think here's the difficulty of what, and the importance of what was just said. We see what happened over 100 years ago potentially happening today, right? The same experience of pulling those Black leaders from the altar where they wanted to pray, where they had to create their own space. It's possible that if we're not careful, we do the same thing without even realizing it in our churches today. And so, powerful statement that if God has anointed us to do it, we'll have to do it, even if we have to create a separate table.
One of the reasons that I think African Americans may not attend white churches, and don't get me wrong, there are white people who don't attend Black churches, but one of the reasons that I believe, for me, at least in my experience, it has been that sometimes we don't know how to take people who don't look like us. We don't understand what we should do with them. When I was in a place where I was looking for a church, one of the things that was amazing to me was how easy it was for people to sort of shut me out because I didn't look like them, or to let me know sort of underhandedly that they were uncomfortable. One time I was at one church and the people asked me, I was the only Black person there, and I'm already feeling a little uncomfortable. And one of the people came up to me and said, well, why are you here? And I was like, because somebody invited me. I didn't just, and the thing is they were like, oh, are you, well, why did you come? Because I was invited. And I wondered if maybe that was the first time they had ever seen a Black person in their church or what it was. But clearly for them, they were uncomfortable with me being there. And even the person who invited me didn't speak to me. I had to go speak to that person. And I was like, well, I guess I won't be coming back here. And even when I was looking for a church, I was looking for a place to attend, and I was in a place where I needed healing. And one of the things that really, it sort of annoyed me was that I went to this church, and I went several times because it was part of the denomination. I wanted to try to make it work. And every time I went, instead of being more comfortable, I was more uncomfortable. And part of it was because, there's the stereotypical tendency to believe that if you're Black, you can sing. And so I was asked, are you going to join our choir? Are you going to join this? Are you going to do that? And I was like, no, I'm just here to observe for right now. And, and it's true, I can sing, but you don't know me to know that I can do that. So don't just come up to me and say, you're going to join our choir. How do you know if I can sing or not? I might sound like a polecat, but you have already put me in a box and made me feel a little defensive. And then I was talking to the pastor, and instead of being a minister to me, it was a pastor who needed ministry. And I was like, you really need to go talk to some people who are above you, who can help you, because you need some, you've got some things that you need to deal with. And while I do coaching and mentoring and things like that, I was not in the place at that point in my life to do it, because I knew that I needed to be healed. And so one of the things that there has to be is that we have to be in a place when people don't look like us, to love them and to cherish them. I know our church was considered the Black church in the community where I lived. And one of the things was that even though it was considered the Black church, we had a significant number of Caucasian people who would worship with us. And then it ended up that our musician was a Caucasian and things like that. And so people asked me, they said, well, why are you comfortable having a white musician? I was like, because it doesn't matter what color the musician is. What matters is whether the musician can play. I said, and the musician can play. And so he's ours. We took him in. And so many times we look at situations and we look at people and we don't understand that we have to learn how to love people. And it's hard when you look at people and you think they have an ulterior motive for coming to your church. I'm coming to worship. I'm from a place where my mother was a drug and alcohol rehabilitation counselor at a Christian organization. And so we would go to her job and they would have chapel, and it was mostly white people. And so I have been in a place where, and then I came up in a denomination where we would go to camp meeting every summer. And so camp meeting, most of the people at camp meeting were white. And so I can worship in any scenario. You can throw me in, I don't care who you are, I'm going to worship. And sometimes I have been in churches, I have preached and ministered and done conferences in all kinds of churches, Episcopal, Lutheran, Presbyterian, denominational, non-denominational. I've been in all of them, and I can go in any one of them and I can worship and I can learn to adapt, because I can be like a chameleon and move along. And sometimes I throw my hands up and it scares them, but they eventually get over it. But we have to learn how to say, if you are coming, what is it that we can do so that we are worshiping together, so that we are workers together? What is it that I can do so that, and instead of saying what makes you uncomfortable about me, how about putting yourself in my shoes and saying, I wonder if she's comfortable. What can I do? There was one church I went to, I was the only person of color there. And I was by myself. I was traveling for work. And I went and I sat down, and this woman, her name was Jane. I will never forget it. She came and she sat down beside me. She said, "Are you new here?" And I was like, she's joking, right? I was like, "Yes, I'm new here." She said, "Well, welcome. My name is Jane. I've worshiped here every Sunday. My grandparents worshiped here," and she gives me her whole family history, and she gives me a worship bulletin. She pulls out the hymn and showed me what hymns we were going to sing. And she sat there with me. And then when people came in, she introduced me. She said, "This is my new friend, Karen." And I was just like, wow. And if I could have replicated that in all of the churches that I had been in, when I had been the only person of color, and she wasn't condescending, but she was loving. And so the thing is that why do sometimes people tend to shy away from worshiping in a predominantly white congregation? It's because they don't feel comfortable. And sometimes they don't feel wanted. And we have to change that. And we have to flip the conversation so that the conversation is not about, so it's not that we have a Black person, but that we welcome people. Because if we welcome people, we understand we welcome souls. Because the one thing I always remember my mother saying, souls don't have color. God's desire is that no soul should perish. So it doesn't matter what the people look like. Their soul needs saving. This is the place for them. Their soul needs healing. This is the place for them. They need peace. This is the place for them. They need to find Jesus. This is the place for them. And that's what it needs to be in our context. If you're a majority congregation, and even if you're a majority white congregation or more majority Black congregation or Latino congregation, whatever you are, when somebody comes in and they don't look like you, embrace them and let them know you're welcome here. You're welcome here. If you need Jesus, if you want to worship, if you love God, whatever it is, you're welcome here. Because if we can do that, we can start erasing the stigmatism that goes along with all of the things where we separate people out by who it is and who we think they are and what they ought to look like. And we just love them to life and help them understand that we're all God's children. And when we worship together, it's just a taste of heaven. Because contrary to popular belief, you're not going to be able to throw me out.